Okay. Here we are. Despite my name, my German will not be adequate for the situation, so I apologize for English. You always have to apologize for English. It's done a lot of damage. And I will also, I'll try to not hold you here for too long. I will speak for about 20 minutes or so, and then we'll have our discussion. So therefore, I will withhold my own comments about the proceedings, the discussion about the symposium itself. I won't say anything about that until we have the discussion, and I'm sure there'll be a lot to talk about. I certainly have a lot to say, and am very grateful for the invitation and for the opportunity to have heard and seen all the wonderful presentations. Indeed, it's an ironic honor here to be asked to think publicly about societal change inside this particular monument to American hegemony, which has now, of course, been converted into such a singularly innovative cultural institution as the HKW. So I'm very grateful for the opportunity to think through that particular irony. And it is doubly an honor to do so under the flag, so to speak, of the Bauhaus in its latest transnational incarnation, the Bauhaus Project. Now, okay. Maybe I date myself a little bit with this Laurie Anderson quote, but maybe it also, does everybody here know who Laurie Anderson is? I don't know. Maybe it also reminds us that history's angel, there's a wonderful song about Berlin, in fact, on this album, Hansel and Gretel, and the Angel of History. History's angel still haunts us after all these years. From its origins under the sign of Leonel Feininger's paradoxical Cathedral of Socialism to the so-called Red Bauhaus, led by Hannes Meyer, who I must say, one of our wonderful PhD students at Columbia, Daniel Telesnik, is currently studying, following around the world, the itinerary of the Red Bauhaus. So there's new scholarship, there's constantly new scholarship on this thing. To its rekindling after a fashion at the Hochschule für Gestaltung at Ulm. Through all these episodes, a certain rather critical branch of the Bauhaus tradition, because of course there are many Bauhauses. And so the one I want to call your attention to is what we can call maybe the dissenting Bauhaus, the critical branch of the Bauhaus tradition that has regularly opened itself to thoughts of systemic societal change, if not revolution per se. Now, in honor of this tradition, and to refer to the theme of the conference, I therefore begin with a quotation from the longtime Ulm faculty member, Thomas Maldonado, from his 1970 book, Design, Nature, and Revolution. So you can read it maybe here. Quote, "A revolution by design has real meaning only if it is supported by design by revolution." Yes, Maldonado was a dialectician, sort of. Both, and perhaps the latter, design by revolution, more than the former, presuppose the acceptance of an operative political praxis, which means the rejection of political nihilism. But both, and this time perhaps the former more than the latter, presuppose an operative praxis of design, which means the rejection of nihilism in design. Okay, so I'll leave you to figure that out. And only just remind you that this was 1970, and Maldonado was referring in his tortured dialectic to specific events within both the artistic and political domains. His subtitle, Towards a Critical Ecology, gives us some sense of that context, in which what he calls the scandal of society, and the scandal of nature converge but are covered up by what he calls the fashion of ecology. This, says Maldonado, and again we are in 1970, this neutralizes real environmental and societal crisis, not by ignoring it, but, as he says, by, quote, forcing everyone to be concerned with it continually. So the best way to neutralize something is not to ignore it, but to call excessive attention to it. Now, to understand what has changed since those days, we have to be more precise about what we mean by society when we ask, can design change society? So just a brief interlude on the specifics of the question. As it happens, that same year, 1970, Michel Foucault, Saint-Michel, began his now famous lectures at the Collège de France. In the third of these, from 1975 to 1976, he took a break in 1974. So the third one, the third series, titled Il faut défendre la société, so society must be defended. He explained the birth of the modern concept of society in the 17th century, a concept that ran underneath the state, which is to say the sovereign, the king, and was not confined within its territorial boundaries. This is familiar to many of you. Society manifested instead as the nation, a body that from then on formed the object of historical study and above all was to be defended, or really produced, by perpetual war. This war was not, Foucault argued, was not an epic Hobbesian war of all against all, but rather a whole proliferation of struggles, large and small, that determined the character of a constantly changing society, tied to the state, but not identical with it. Now, when we recognize that even when he was speaking about ancient Greece, Foucault was also speaking about his own historical present, and when we remember the work of his colleague Jacques Donzelot and others on the invention of the social in the 19th century as an object of state-based administration, like psychiatry, education, housing, or social work, we realize that Foucault was speaking about a process that was reaching its end. For it was during this period, as Maldonado's comments testify, this period, the 1970s, that the administration of the social, most starkly through the institutions of the Western or Northern welfare state, but not exclusively, and captured in the code word environment, that this was being handed over to another set of powers, most of which have, in a sense, been what we've been talking about today, another set of powers, and hence was changing dramatically. By this, I mean the much-discussed neoliberal turn, which, as it happens, we will explore with respect to housing in the Wohnungsfrage Academy here at the HKW in a couple of weeks, so you can come back for that, about a month. In the meantime, now most accounts, including Foucault's own, center this turn, because Foucault wrote about the rise of, about the birth of basically the rise of neoliberalism. He centers, like most, this turn on the early 1970s. Starts earlier, but sort of the real shift is the 70s. The difference being that where others, like David Harvey, emphasize neoliberalism's ideological commitment to privatization and the rule of markets, Foucault emphasizes the practical transformation of what used to be called society into a garden for growing what neoliberal economists call human capital. Human capital, in brief, is a whole range of technical and cognitive abilities, again, we've been discussing this all day, that are cultivated in any given population through the family, in school, and in the workplace, all of which can be given market value. Like it or not, then, as teachers, we tend the gardens of exchangeable human capital when we train architects and designers to be architects and designers, the range of whose education qualifies them as eminently flexible Foucauldian abilities machines, as he put it in a kind of Deleuzean turn. And so the question is not how these abilities machines might change some pre-existing society. The question is how and under what powers what used to be called society has already changed into an assemblage of abilities machines. So I'm speaking as an historian. I mean, if the one thing that historians can tell you, they can't tell you very much, but they can tell you that things change. And this is one account of a certain kind of change. Now, to conclude this first part of my remarks before going on in the panel to the conference proceedings, I wanted to just offer one example from my own city, New York. So it's a kind of report from New York, if you don't mind. And some of it is very obvious, but maybe not as clear. Last week was the 14th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, an obscene consequence of which was the US invasion of Iraq, a consequence of the attacks, which was, in turn, among the preconditions, let's say it was a necessary, if not sufficient, but certainly a necessary precondition, for the current Syrian conflict, from which millions of refugees are now, of course, in dangerous flight. It is no accident that the American news media, including the conservative Fox News, but also the New York Times, the so-called newspaper of record, that they continue to refer to these millions as migrants rather than refugees. For, as Foucault says, in the eyes of neoliberalism, quote, this is Foucault, quote, migration is an investment. The migrant is an investor. He is an entrepreneur of himself who incurs expenses to obtain some kind of improvement. Now, in this light, it is no surprise that refugees would be rewritten as migrants, or in other words, human capital, as if they do not seek refuge because their livelihoods have vanished or their lives are threatened, but rather as if they seek only economic opportunity, a text that also underwrites xenophobic European discourse on the matter, the refugee as an economic burden, and eventually as a competitor. This is one of many wars within wars by which society is both being defended and redefined today on the terms, essentially, of this neoliberal project. Nor is it surprising that meanwhile, one historical ground zero of these events, ground zero in New York, is being dramatically reshaped by design, and very specifically by design, from a site of loss and of nationalist vengeance into a reservoir of human capital. So this is becoming a reservoir of human capital. No architect and no project demonstrates this more clearly than Bjarke Ingels and his firm, BIG, with their recently announced project for 2 World Trade Center, the last of the 4 towers in the master plan. Before addressing briefly this particular monument to neoliberalism and its wars, I want to remind you of a few others. So just a little bit of a background. Here, this is a photo montage made by my partner, Kadamburi Bakshi, that shows the occupation of Zuccotti Park in Lower Manhattan, you may remember, during the height of the Occupy Wall Street protests in the fall of 2011. The photo montage, however, turns deliberately away from Wall Street, which is actually at our backs if we're in this photo, in the image, and toward Ground Zero. That's what you're seeing. You're seeing Ground Zero through Zuccotti Park. Why? Because that is where Wall Street and everything that it stands for actually is. But it was impossible, unthinkable even, for there to be an Occupy Ground Zero. Can you imagine? They tried everything but not that. Even as Fumihiko Maki's, you can see that, the building in the back, Maki's mirrored glass skyscraper designed for the developer Larry Silverstein, was under construction on the left, towering over Zuccotti Park. And this, by the way, is the same Fumihiko Maki who learned from Team 10, very progressive, and was a member of the Japanese Metabolists, avant-garde. Now unapologetically building a symbol of American military and financial triumph. That's what that is. There could be no Occupy Ground Zero or Occupy SOM or Occupy Maki, simply because the site of the former World Trade Center was considered by many to be sacred ground, and thus out of bounds for political protest. And yet, this sacred ground is what Wall Street actually is and looks like. From the planned 10 million square feet of a new Class A office space in the towers to, you see the thing, to the 9/11 Memorial and Museum, to the reconstructed World Financial Center. There's a World Financial Center, a monument to postmodernism. It was the first thing they rebuilt. Desperately, quickly, without any discussion or anything, they rebuilt World Finance a la Caesar Pelli, just as it was. It's beautiful. It's right across the street from Ground Zero, you probably know. And then from there, just next door, the Goldman Sachs headquarters, built with massive federal subsidies, just up the street. And across the Hudson River from that, the other Goldman Sachs. And then from there, the computer sheds in Secaucus, New Jersey, just beyond, that have hosted the infamous flash crashes and so on and so forth. So this is Wall Street. All of that and more is what Wall Street actually is today. And hence the engines of equality and of inequality and of dispossession that have driven so many of the protests and the dissent against this neoliberal project. Not some antiquated neoclassical building with a giant American flag draped over it, the New York Stock Exchange, or even the old Kevin Roche, this is a kind of tour of postmodernism, the Kevin Roche J.P. Morgan atrium. This is actually where Occupy Wall Street met. This is where it happened. They would have regularly meetings every day during the whole time at those tables in the Kevin Roche postmodernist J.P. Morgan atrium. But no, Ground Zero and its surroundings are as close as you get to something like the real Wall Street in Lower Manhattan. Sacred ground, marked most visibly with a building that was once pompously named the Freedom Tower and has now recently been renamed One World Trade Center, designed by David Childs of Skidmore, Owings & Merrill, SOM, with a 14-story concrete bunker cynically wrapped in energy-efficient glass, and a metaphysical view toward infinite horizons above. Now that's kind of phase one, right? So now we're at the other end of this process, and we're at the last building, and so Wired magazine recently points out that the anchor tenant of One World Trade Center, this building, was its parent company, the media giant Condé Nast. This is in the context of a kind of expose, an article on announcing the Bjarke Ingels project, the final building. And the magazine says, quote, "The once dowdy area known as the financial district has been transformed by an influx of companies from the advertising, design, and tech industry." So advertising, design, and tech industries. In other words, Ground Zero as a garden, as I said, for abilities machines, like designers, trained in affective labor. Alongside Childs, Maki, and Richard Rogers, Norman Foster had been the architect chosen by the developer Larry Silverstein to design the last of the site's 4 towers. This was a little bit of a mini drama in architecture culture. But Silverstein's deal with Citigroup as an anchor tenant for that tower fell through in 2013, and in order to finance the project, he needed a new major tenant. This is the developer of the whole site. Enter Rupert Murdoch and his son James, born incidentally in 1972, James Murdoch, so 2 years after Maldonado's book, now CEO of 21st Century Fox, the parent company of Fox News. I say that because it is almost impossible to exaggerate the role played by Fox News in amplifying the deadly mix of post-9/11 paranoia, triumphalism, and neo-imperialism that authorized the US invasion of Iraq. But interestingly, the line from tragedy to farce, and there are many of these, but the line from tragedy to farce that has the company now moving its headquarters from Rockefeller Center, which was a monument built by oil money, to Ground Zero, where the oil-soaked blood has been washed away by the water pouring continuously through the memorial's twin fountains. Let's see if I have them. There they are. So this has washed away the oil-soaked blood. But in order to get to this final building, there had to be a corresponding change in design, just as Maldonado's dialectic predicted. In other words, Norman Foster was not right for the job because he was with the wrong client. So simply because in order for Silverstein to get his new tenant, to get Fox and company in the building, they had to go with their architect. They needed, basically this is how it goes. Silverstein needs an anchor tenant in order to get the financing to build the building in the first place, right? So if Fox doesn't say yes, then he can't get the money to build the building, right? So, but the condition was that you have to switch architects. So he had to fire Foster and hire Fox's architect, Bjarke Ingels. And indeed, true to the cliches of his generation, the younger Murdoch, who had been born in 1972, this young CEO, son of Rupert, it seems, had been impressed by Ingels' proposal for the, so here, this is the, sorry, we went from that to that. So young Murdoch had been impressed by this. Ingels' proposal for the expansion of Google's headquarters in Mountain View, California, which, as you can see, recycles precisely the technocratic managerial combination of environmentalism and environmental psychology. Foucault called it environmentality, that met Maldonado's disdain and indeed his fury in 1970. So Maldonado saw this coming, I must say, at the Bauhaus, at Ulm. So the Bauhaus, okay. So anyway, what we have here then is this. Not architecture helplessly acting in the service of capital, looking to humanize or otherwise moderate its excesses. I can't emphasize, this is not just about the client, like working for the bad guys or something like that. This is about being part of that, structurally part of that system. You take that away and you don't get the building, right? So what we have here then in the partnership of Ingels and the owners of Fox News is architecture, and a very specific design language at that, as a precondition for the movement of capital. Architecture as investment in all senses. No Ingels designing the tower, no Murdochs renting it, and therefore no financing to build it in the first place. The specifics of that design language, we can call it OMA for beginners, barely merit description. They are, the building is basically a series of architectural talking points, which Ingels performs, here, this is again, the final. But so Ingels performs these talking points enthusiastically in an online marketing video presented by 21st Century Fox and News Corporation that addresses one by one, he goes one by one through possible objections from his multiple constituents. So a stack of boxes to offset its scale, a deferential bow towards David Child's 1776-foot tall tower next door. Then within the boxes, offset elevator cores for Silicon Valley style open floor plates suited to the flexible, playful managerial strategies of the media industry. Here is the human capital. And then, of course, a, quote, vertical village where inevitably, quote, diversity becomes unity, and so on. So those are the cliches. However, concealed by the reflective glass at the top, but shown in the video, sits an array of Fox News satellite antennas. There they are. Prepared to spread the next toxic cocktail of nationalism and neoliberalism around the planet. Of course, a more detailed analysis, which we don't really have time for, but a more detailed analysis would compare this partnership to that between Ingalls, and it's a partnership, right? It's not a client partnership. Between Ingalls' mentor, Rem Koolhaas, and the CCTV, the China Central Television in Beijing. Let us only point out here in historical shorthand that in the case of Koolhaas, the collaborator is the military-industrial state, basically, to which the mass media remains subordinate, more or less, or an organ of, or a function of. The CCTV, therefore, belongs at least partly to the older order. In the case of Ingalls, however, the collaborator is the military-industrial state made subordinate to the mass media as market. So it's the new ruler, which is managed by the younger Murdoch in proper neoliberal fashion. In that sense, while Koolhaas's CCTV building may not quite be the face of Chinese neoliberalism, but only its immediate precursor. It's what comes before what is likely to be the real turn in China. No more weird architecture, says Xi Jinping, perhaps ushering in a different brand of neoliberal nationalism. It is no exaggeration to describe Ingalls' tower at Ground Zero as the state's neoliberal apotheosis, specifically in the manner that it defends the society of entrepreneurs, abilities machines populating its open offices and drawn together by its television channels with warlike ruthlessness. This is how design changes society every day. The question is whether it can be changed differently. So it's not a yes or no question. It's what's the difference? To speak with Deleuze and all of our French colleagues. Transitioning to the subjects discussed at the conference, I'll only say that first we need to ask, how did this happen? I mean, this is something that we can actually do without much trouble. How did this happen? How did this come to be? We had all these historical surveys and so on. How on earth did this happen? How did a field that has been so enriched over the years by the critical lineage within the Bauhaus, a field that has been drawing points, lines, and planes from Meyer to Maldonado, how did this field allow its dissident project to be captured and imprisoned in the infantilized videographic grin of a system that has joyously built careers on the ruins of the welfare state? Now, of course, I do not mean this personally, except to the extent that Ingalls, Gary, Hadid, and others have mobilized, that is, sold for real money, their personae, their faces, and their names commercially in the service of the neoliberal war machine. I only mean that we should be embarrassed, ashamed even, that we have allowed design to change society in such a way. How to change it differently, then, is a matter for further discussion, which I think we will now do. Okay. All right. There we are. We can't leave that up there. Sorry.